If you love heartwarming tales of courage and the unbreakable bond between kids and dogs, hit that subscribe button on K9 Miracle Stories right now. Don't be one of those viewers who watches without joining our pack of animal lovers. The courtroom was thick with tension, every eye fixed on the small figure standing at the front of the room. You could hear the shuffle of feet, the soft hum of whispers, the occasional rattle of a chair scraping the floor. But there was one sound that drowned out everything else. Silence. A silence so deep, so thick that it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. All eyes were on Emma, a 3-year-old girl who was about to take the stand in one of the most emotionally charged cases the city had seen in years. What dark secret had she buried since that fateful night? And would she finally reveal it, or stay silent forever? The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the back rows, cameras rolling, eager to capture every moment of the trial. But no one knew what would happen next. Emma had not spoken a word since the night her mother was found unconscious in their home. She was the only living witness to what had happened, but she had been silent. Silent with fear, silent with pain, and silent with the weight of the trauma she had endured. The accused, her mother's boyfriend, sat calmly in his seat, his defense already set to tear apart the fragile case that had been built against him. Would Emma speak? Would she remember what happened? Or would the defense win as they had so many times before, casting doubt on the reliability of a child's testimony? The courtroom held its breath, and so did the world. The judge, a woman with years of experience and a reputation for compassion, looked down at the case file in front of her. She had reviewed it over and over, trying to find a crack in the case. But it wasn't the evidence that concerned her. It was Emma. The court clerk's voice cracked through the silence. The witness is now on the stand. With trembling hands, Emma's foster mother guided the little girl into the courtroom. She was wearing a pale blue dress, the kind that might remind you of the summer days you spent running through fields as a child. But it wasn't the dress that caught everyone's attention. It was a stuffed bunny in Emma's hand, the half-torn ear hanging limply from overuse. Emma's tiny hand gripped the fabric of her foster mother's sleeve. Her eyes were wide, scanning the room in fear as her gaze flitted from one face to another. But when her eyes landed on one specific figure, something changed. A sense of calm seemed to wash over her. Ranger, the police therapy dog, stood at the foot of the witness chair, his large brown eyes calm and focused, his posture relaxed but alert. Ranger wasn't just any dog. He was trained to help children like Emma, children who had seen the world's darkest corners. And right now, as Emma looked at him, she saw something familiar, something safe. Without hesitation, Emma shuffled toward him, letting go of her foster mother's hand. Her tiny fingers reached for Ranger's thick fur, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, she leaned into him. She didn't look back at the jury or the judge. She didn't even notice the murmurs rippling through the courtroom. All she saw was Ranger, and in that moment, she whispered something so softly that only the dog could hear. "He's the bad one." The room froze. The defense attorney, James Elmore, shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor." His voice was sharp, but the judge quickly overruled him. The courtroom was too stunned to even react. The only sound that could be heard was Emma's small voice, barely above a whisper, but with an eerie clarity. It wasn't much, but it was enough to change the course of the trial. Emma had spoken. She had named the man who had hurt her mother, and in doing so, she had unlocked something that no amount of evidence could ever do: truth. But was this just the beginning? What more horrors would her whispers reveal? The prosecutor, Jane Hollis, stood from her seat, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't prepared for this. No one was. But Emma had just given them a lifeline. She had provided a clue, a single sentence that would send shockwaves through the rest of the trial. As the trial continued, Emma's testimony became less about the words she spoke and more about the connection between her and Ranger. Each time she was asked a question, she leaned into the dog, quietly whispering her answers, sometimes so softly that no one but Ranger could hear. Yet, each of those moments carried weight, like stones being placed one by one in a foundation that would soon become unshakable. But it wasn't just the dog that made Emma feel safe. It was the bond between them, the trust that Emma had built with Ranger in the weeks leading up to the trial. For a child who had witnessed unspeakable horrors, the dog had become her shield. He had given her something no one else could, comfort in the space to speak her truth. At one point during the recess, as the jury filed out, Jane approached Emma. She knelt down and spoke softly to the little girl. "Emma," she said, "try and be gentle. Can you tell me more about what happened that night? Can you remember?" Emma didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned to Ranger and whispered something into his ear. The dog's tail flicked, but he remained calm, as if understanding the magnitude of the moment. And when Emma spoke again, her voice was steady. "He knows," she whispered, almost as if to herself. He saw. Jane's heart raced. This was it. The dog wasn't just there for comfort anymore. Ranger was playing a role in unlocking the memories that Emma had buried so deep inside her. The courtroom would have to accept it, no matter how unconventional it seemed. Ranger was more than a witness. He was a key. But could this bond hold up against the defense's relentless attacks? As the trial continued, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. The tension, once palpable, was now laced with hope. Emma was speaking, slowly, quietly, and with the help of a dog who had become her silent protector. Ranger's presence in the courtroom wasn't just a novelty, it was necessary. With each passing day, the case against the accused grew stronger, not just because of Emma's testimony, but because of the unspoken bond between a little girl and a dog. The prosecution had a long road ahead, but for the first time since the trial began, there was a flicker of hope that justice could be done. Would Emma's words be enough to convict the man who had hurt her mother? The answer was still unclear, but one thing was certain. Emma's bravery and the unshakable loyalty of Ranger had cracked open a case that once seemed impossible to solve. The trial was unlike any other. It wasn't about who had the most evidence or who could deliver the most powerful speech. This trial was about silence, the quiet presence of a child, the even quieter presence of a dog. And somehow, it was all speaking louder than anything that had come before. Emma sat at the witness stand, clutching Ranger's collar with both hands. She had never felt more secure in her life. Ranger, a German shepherd with eyes full of calm understanding, sat perfectly still beside her, his body relaxed but alert, as though he knew that the weight of the world was pressing down on this little girl. The courtroom had shifted. What was once an icy tension had turned to a tentative hope. It was subtle, but it was there. People were beginning to understand that something profound was happening, something more than just a trial. Emma wasn't just a victim. She wasn't just a child who had witnessed a tragedy. No, she was a key to everything. And Ranger was helping her unlock it. For the first time in weeks, Emma didn't feel scared. She didn't feel like she had to hide behind a mask of silence. She had her truth, and with Ranger by her side, it was time to speak it. But what if the defense found a way to twist her words? "Emma," Jane Hollis, the prosecutor, said gently, her voice low but confident, "can you tell us what happened that night?" The question seemed so simple, but Emma had spent weeks wrestling with it. There had been times she had wanted to speak, but the words just wouldn't come. Not until now. Not until she was sitting here with Ranger, feeling the steady warmth of his fur beneath her small fingers. Emma leaned in close to Ranger's ear, whispering to him as if she were telling him a secret no one else could hear. The room watched, the quiet stretching between each breath, and then Emma spoke. "He knows," she said, her voice barely audible. But for those in the room who were paying attention, it was a moment that felt like a thunderclap in the stillness. The judge, a woman known for her calm and careful decisions, adjusted her glasses. She leaned forward, watching the exchange between Emma and Ranger with interest. No one had expected this. No one had expected that a dog, a therapy dog, would become a conduit for truth. But here it was. Emma, her little voice quivering but steady, had begun her testimony. The gallery, once tense and judgmental, now sat in stunned silence. Emma had done it. She had spoken, and the words she said, though small, were enough to shift the entire trajectory of the case. Emma's foster mother, seated quietly in the back of the room, felt her heart race with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Emma hadn't spoken to anyone since the attack, but now here she was, speaking to a dog, speaking her truth. Jane Hollis looked over at the defense attorney, James Elmore, who was no longer sitting confidently in his chair. His usual air of control was gone, replaced by a tense, clenched jaw. Elmore had expected to have an easy time of this. His client, the accused, had a spotless record and a defense so airtight that it seemed impossible to penetrate. But now, Emma's testimony had shattered that illusion. "You're sure of what you said, Emma?" Jane asked gently, kneeling down to her level so that Emma wouldn't have to look up. Emma's eyes, wide and trusting, flicked back to Ranger. "I'm sure," Emma whispered, as if confirming it to herself as much as to anyone else. Emma's small hands tightened around Ranger's collar as she looked down at him, her fingers moving absent-mindedly over his fur. She then looked up, a faint glimmer of resolve in her eyes. She had seen the man's face. She had heard his voice. She knew what had happened. Ranger, he was there. He saw, Emma said softly, her words barely rising above a whisper. The room seemed to hold its breath again. Everyone was waiting for her to continue. But Emma didn't speak more. She didn't need to. It was as though Emma had just unlocked something deep within herself. A vault of memories long buried under fear and silence. And Ranger, with his calm presence and unwavering loyalty, had helped her find the key. Emma's testimony was slow, but steady. With each word she spoke to Ranger, she peeled back another layer of the trauma she had experienced. She spoke of the loud sound she had heard that night, the crash of furniture, the anger in the man's voice. "He yelled at Mommy," Emma said quietly. Then he broke the table. Her voice was small, but each word carried with a power no one had anticipated. The jury, leaning in to catch every word, could see it in her eyes, the certainty, the fear, and the truth. For the first time since the trial began, the defense attorney, Elmore, stood up, his voice laced with disbelief. "Your Honor, I must object. This child is barely capable of distinguishing fiction from reality. What we're hearing here is nothing more than the imagination of a frightened little girl." But the judge, known for her careful wisdom, only nodded. Objection overruled. The defense team exchanged worried glances. It was one thing to discredit a child's testimony in the abstract, but it was another thing entirely to watch this little girl, with the quiet but firm support of Ranger, speak her truth in front of a room full of strangers. At that moment, Jane Hollis could feel the shift in the courtroom. There was a crack in Elmore's defense, a small but noticeable crack. Emma wasn't just a frightened child anymore. She was a survivor. She was the voice that the world had been waiting for, the truth the court needed to hear. But there was more. Emma's quiet voice was not the only thing that had begun to break open the case. As Emma's testimony continued, the truth started to fall into place. "Can you tell me where you were, Emma, when you heard the noise?" Jane asked gently, her eyes locked with the little girl's. Emma hesitated. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. "A drawing?" Jane unfolded it slowly. It was a child's drawing, a crude depiction of a room, a table, and a large figure standing near it. The larger figure was drawn with jagged, angry lines, and a small stick figure was hidden beneath the table, drawn with lines that suggested fear. "This is me," Emma whispered. "I was hiding under the table." It was a simple drawing, but it spoke volumes. The image matched the forensic evidence. Shattered glass, a broken table, and a child who had been hiding. The gallery gasped. Elmore's confident demeanor had faltered. He now knew that things were shifting. His airtight defense was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The jury, once uncertain, now saw the consistency in Emma's testimony. She had not been coached. She had not been led. She had spoken her truth, however small, and it matched the evidence. Jane stood tall, turning back to the judge. "Your Honor, we'd like to submit this drawing into evidence." The judge nodded. "The drawing is admissible. It was happening." The pieces were falling into place, and the man who had once seemed untouchable was now on the defensive. But it wasn't just Emma's words. It was Ranger. The bond between them had made it possible for Emma to speak, if only in whispers. And with every word, every drawing, every subtle action, Emma was unraveling a case that had once seemed impossible to solve. As the recess began, Jane stood alone for a moment, reflecting on what had just transpired. She knew there was still more to come. But one thing was clear. This case had changed. And with Emma's courage and the unspoken power of Ranger, the truth was coming to light. The courtroom was filled with a strange energy as Emma sat on the witness stand, her small hand still clutching Ranger's collar. It was an energy that was hard to define, an anxious anticipation mixed with a sense of hope. The defense, once so confident, now seemed to be on the defensive. Every move, every gesture, was scrutinized by the gallery, the jury, the judge, and the prosecution. But it was Emma, the quiet 3-year-old girl, who held the room in her grip. Emma hadn't said much since the last session. Only a few words whispered into Ranger's ear. But those words had been enough to turn the tide of the trial. Now, as she sat there with her head slightly lowered, clutching her stuffed bunny with one hand and Ranger's collar with the other, she was about to offer something even more powerful. A picture. The drawing was crumpled, like something she had tucked away in her pocket, a secret she hadn't fully shared. She had kept it close, probably unsure what it meant or how to express it. But now, in the midst of this trial, it felt like the right time. Emma, honey, Jane Hollis, the prosecutor, began softly. She knelt down at Emma's level, speaking in a voice meant only for her. Can you tell me about your drawing? Can you tell the court what you see in this picture? Emma looked up slowly, her wide eyes searching the room before landing on Ranger. She had trusted him before. He had been there when no one else was, had given her the space to speak when she had no voice. Now she was ready to share something else. Emma reached into the pocket of her pale blue dress, pulling out the drawing. Her tiny fingers unfolded it carefully, as if afraid the paper might tear, revealing the image she had kept hidden. It was simple. A stick figure of a child huddled under a table, its legs bent in fear. Above, a larger figure loomed, drawn with jagged, angry lines. There were thick scribbles around the figure's hands, making it clear that whatever this man had done, it wasn't a simple action. It was violent. The table was broken in two, right down the middle, and pieces of furniture were scattered around the edges. Ranger remained perfectly still, his large brown eyes focused on Emma. He was her silent protector. His steady presence had allowed her to feel safe enough to even make the drawing. Emma had said little since she was placed on the stand, but her drawings, her whispered words to Ranger, those had spoken volumes. As Jane took the drawing in her hands, she studied it for a moment. It wasn't much, just a child's perspective of what had happened, but it was powerful. It matched the details of the crime scene. The broken table, the loud crash, the pieces of furniture scattered in chaos. Emma had been hiding under the table, and now the world could see it. This is your drawing, Emma? Jane asked gently, though she knew the answer. Emma nodded silently. And this man, Jane continued, her voice soft but clear, the one with the angry scribbled hands. Is this the man who hurt your mommy? Emma hesitated for a moment, her eyes glancing at Ranger before returning to the drawing. Then she looked up at Jane, her voice barely a whisper. He yelled. Mommy fell. He broke the table. The courtroom was silent, the tension so thick it felt like it could be cut with a knife. No one moved. No one spoke. All eyes were on Emma. Jane held the drawing up for the jury to see. It was a child's drawing, but it was too accurate, too detailed to dismiss. The table broken in half, the angry figure standing above the child, the fear conveyed in the simple lines. It was an undeniable link between Emma's memory and the physical evidence. The broken table, the glass scattered across the floor, the pieces were all fitting together. The defense stood up immediately, his face flushed with frustration. Objection, Your Honor, Elmore said, his voice sharp. This is a child's drawing. It's inadmissible. It's nothing more than a child's fantasy. The judge, however, did not immediately rule. Instead, she looked over at the drawing, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. She knew the defense was right in some respects. It was a child's drawing, not a photograph or forensic report. But it wasn't the picture that mattered most. It was the truth behind it. The judge turned back to court. I will allow the drawing as evidence, but I remind the jury that it is one piece of the puzzle. It must be considered alongside all other evidence presented in this case. The defense attorney, Elmore, clenched his jaw, but didn't argue further. It was clear that his once unshakable defense had begun to crack. The jury, now faced with the haunting simplicity of Emma's drawing, looked visibly shaken. "You're doing great, Emma," Jane said softly as she bent down to the little girl's level again. "Can you tell us more about what you remember?" Emma didn't answer immediately. She had been speaking in whispers to Ranger, sharing bits and pieces of what had happened the night of the attack. But it wasn't just words that were coming out. She had been drawing, remembering, and now she was going to share one more piece of the puzzle. Emma reached into her pocket once more, pulling out another drawing. It was different from the first. This time, it was more abstract, less structured. It wasn't a figure under a table. It wasn't an angry man with jagged hands. Instead, it was a house. But there was something off about the house, something that Emma couldn't fully explain. The roof was jagged, the windows broken, the walls had cracks running through them, and one of the corners was completely shattered. The ground beneath the house was covered with scribbled lines that suggested chaos and destruction. Jane took the drawing gently from Emma's hands and held it up for the jury. "And this?" she asked. "What does this picture mean, Emma?" Emma looked at the picture, and then at Ranger. She whispered softly, "That's the house. That's where everything broke." The gallery was still. The courtroom held its collective breath. No one had seen it coming, but Emma had done it again. Her drawing, her words, each one was another piece of the mystery she was slowly unraveling. The evidence was piling up. The broken house mirrored the shattered pieces of Emma's own life. The defense had no choice but to watch as the prosecution built its case. One drawing, one whisper at a time. Elmore's objections became weaker, more desperate. Emma had not only spoken with Ranger, she had spoken through him, through the bond they shared. Emma was able to find the words, to find the images, to tell her story in a way no one else could. As the courtroom began to adjourn for a brief recess, Jane stood next to Emma and Ranger, her thoughts racing. She hadn't expected the trial to go this way, but Emma had shown them all something remarkable. She had shown them her truth, wrapped in the simplest of drawings, shared quietly with a dog who had become her voice. When the court reconvened, there was a subtle shift. The tension that had once felt suffocating was now filled with anticipation. Emma had become more than a victim. She had become the story. She was the truth that no one could deny. But the defense still had its cards to play. Would they be able to discredit Emma's testimony? Or was the truth, as fragile as it seemed, finally strong enough to stand on its own? The next phase of the trial was about to begin, and the courtroom, like the broken house in Emma's drawing, was ready to collapse under the weight of the truth. The courtroom was quieter than it had ever been. Every time Emma whispered a Ranger, the room held its breath, waiting for the next piece of the puzzle to fall into place. There was a strange kind of stillness now, a reverence of the small child who had already done what many believed was impossible. Her voice, though small, had begun to carry the weight of an entire case. Emma's testimony had become something of an enigma. She had spoken, but not in the way anyone expected. It was in the quiet moments with Ranger that she had unlocked memories she hadn't been able to articulate until now. And each time her whispers told more of the story, pieces that no one had expected to find. The more Emma spoke, the more the defense's airtight case seemed to unravel. "Emma," Jane Hollis, the prosecutor, asked gently, kneeling beside the little girl once more, "can you tell us about that night? Can you tell us what happened when Mommy was hurt?" Emma looked down at Ranger, and for a moment, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her next words. Emma's fingers gently twisted Ranger's collar, and she leaned in close to him, whispering something that only he could hear. There was a pause. The air in the room thickened with anticipation. "He's the bad one," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He made Mommy fall." She screamed. Her words were soft, but the effect was electric. The prosecutor could see it in the jury's eyes. The truth was slowly, quietly emerging. It wasn't just the words. It was how Emma spoke them. There was no drama, no grand speech, just a simple statement. The way a child would talk about something that she had seen, but had never been able to say. The truth had been trapped inside Emma, and now she was unlocking it piece by piece. For the first time since the trial began, Elmore, the defense attorney, looked uncomfortable. His usual smooth confidence had evaporated. He stood up abruptly, raising an objection, but his voice lacked the conviction it had earlier. "Objection, Your Honor," Elmore said, his voice shaking just slightly. "This child, she's too young to understand complexities of what's going on here. This is absurd." The judge looked over at Elmore, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Elmore, you've had your objections. This court will continue. We will not disregard the testimony of this child. It was happening." The defense's argument had been built on doubt, on questioning whether a child could remember the events so clearly, on dismissing Emma's words as little more than imagination. But Emma wasn't imagining. She wasn't playing. She was speaking the truth, and it was undeniable. Emma continued, her voice shaky but certain, as though she was slowly finding the words she had been afraid to say. She whispered again to Ranger, who with his calming presence helped unlock more of her memories. "There was a crash," Emma whispered, her small voice barely audible. "Mommy screamed. I was hiding." The courtroom was silent. Even the clatter of pens or the shuffle of feet seemed to vanish. There was nothing but Emma's words hanging in the air, slowly revealing the horrors of that night. The jury was locked in. The defense had no answers, no objections left. "What happened when you were hiding, Emma?" Jane asked, leaning in closer, her voice as soft as a lullaby. Emma's eyes flicked over to Ranger again, and she leaned in, speaking quietly to him. "He didn't see me, but I saw him," she said, her voice full of both fear and a strange kind of clarity. "I was under the table. I was scared." Her words weren't just a child's fear. They were the truth. And those simple words carried the weight of everything that had happened. The pieces were starting to fall into place. The forensic evidence, the broken furniture, the bruises on the victim, all of it was aligning with Emma's testimony. Jane took a deep breath, holding back the emotions that threatened to rise. She knew what had come next, and it wasn't going to be easy, but they had come too far to stop now. "Emma," Jane began, her voice steady despite the emotion swirling inside of her. "Do you remember what the man looked like? Can you tell us about him?" Emma's eyes flicked to Ranger once more, as if seeking reassurance, and then without hesitation, she nodded. Her small hand grasped Ranger's collar once more, and she whispered softly, as if the words were a secret meant only for him. "I remember," she whispered. "He was big. His face was scary. He yelled." Emma had started to paint a picture, a simple picture, but it was enough. She was telling them what had happened. She was telling them who had done it. The description was vague but unmistakable. It fit the profile of the man who was on trial, the man who had once seemed untouchable. But the defense, ever the expert in evasion, tried to counter once more. Elmore stood, his face flushed with frustration. "Your Honor," he said, his voice growing more desperate by the second, "this is pure speculation. A child's memory is not reliable, especially when that child is under such extreme duress." But the judge was unmoved. "We've heard enough, Mr. Elmore," she said calmly, her voice carrying authority. "The jury will consider the entirety of the evidence. They will not dismiss this testimony simply because it comes from a child." Emma's gaze never left Ranger as she continued, her fingers gently tracing the fur on his neck. Her whispers were becoming more confident, more coherent. She wasn't just telling her story anymore. She was owning it. "Mommy said, 'Run,'" Emma said suddenly, her voice filled with a sense of urgency, as if remembering the words her mother had spoken to her in that moment of terror. "But I couldn't. I was too scared. I hid." The courtroom gasped in unison. The impact of Emma's words was unmistakable. She had been there. She had seen it. She had hidden, just as the evidence had suggested. As the trial continued, the defense attorney seemed to shrink in the face of Emma's quiet bravery. He had no more objections, no more counterarguments. Emma's voice, though small and soft, had become the most powerful thing in that room. During the next recess, Jane stood alone, her mind racing. She had known the case wasn't going to be easy, but Emma had done something no one could have expected. The child had brought the truth to the surface, not through a dramatic speech, not through courtroom theatrics, but through silence, through whispers, through the quiet bond with Ranger. She knew there was still work to be done. The defense would fight tooth and nail, but Emma had cracked the case wide open. Her testimony had done what no one else could have done. It had turned the tide. As the trial reconvened, the energy in the room had changed. There was still tension, of course. The stakes were as high as ever. But the shift was undeniable. Emma was no longer the scared little girl hiding behind her stuffed bunny. She was a witness. No, she was a survivor. And she was going to make sure that the truth would be heard. And with Ranger by her side, she wasn't afraid anymore. The courtroom was listening. The truth was finally being heard. The courtroom was buzzing with tension as the morning session began. The weight of Emma's testimony still hung in the air, thick with significance. But there was something more now, something that had shifted, something that everyone in the room could feel. Emma's words, small and whispered, had cracked open the case. Now it was time to put the final pieces together. Would the jury buy what they were hearing? Could a child's testimony and the loyalty of a dog really bring down a man as powerful and calculated as a defendant? As Emma's words echoed in their minds, the defense's strategy became clear. They would fight to discredit her testimony. They had to. There was no other option. If Emma's accusation stood, it would destroy their carefully constructed defense. The prosecution, on the other hand, knew that every word Emma spoke could be the key to unlocking the truth once and for all. Elmore, the defense attorney, stood up as the court reconvened, his face flushed with frustration. He could feel the heat of the moment pressing down on him. His usual confidence had started to crack, and it was becoming more evident with every passing minute. "Your Honor," Elmore began, his voice sharp, "I must object once again. This is getting absurd. A 3-year-old child, barely capable of understanding the events she witnessed, is leading this trial. I asked the court to dismiss her testimony. The judge, a woman with decades of experience, didn't flinch. She had heard it all before. Mr. Elmore, your objections are noted, but I will not dismiss this testimony. It is the jury's job to weigh the evidence presented. Your argument does not change the fact that the child is speaking, and she is speaking her truth." Emma, sitting quietly beside Ranger, her hand gently resting on his fur, seemed unaware of the storm raging around her. She was focused only on the dog, her small fingers absent-mindedly stroking his collar. There was no doubt in her mind. Ranger had been there when no one else could. He had been her constant, her protector, and now he was helping her speak in a way she had never been able before. The defense had no choice but to continue with their cross-examination, though it was clear they were grasping at straws. Elmore's voice grew more impatient with each question. "Emma," he said, kneeling down to her level, "can you tell us again exactly what you saw that night? You said you saw a man. Can you describe him?" Emma, her small face serious, looked directly at Elmore for the first time. Her wide brown eyes were unblinking. She didn't seem afraid of him, though he was the one responsible for making her feel small and helpless in this moment. She glanced briefly at Ranger, then back at Elmore. "I saw him," Emma said, her voice steady but quiet. "He was big. His hands were angry. He yelled. It wasn't much, just a few words, but they were enough to make the room go still. The jury, the gallery, everyone was listening now." Elmore pressed on, trying to poke holes in her story, but it was clear his arguments were becoming weaker with each passing minute. "What do you mean by angry hands, Emma?" Elmore asked, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Can you explain how you know his hands were angry?" Emma didn't answer right away. She didn't have to. She turned to Ranger and whispered again, soft enough that only he could hear. Her fingers trembled slightly as she stroked his fur. And when she spoke again, her voice was a little more certain, a little stronger. "His hands hurt Mommy," Emma said, her voice quiet but firm. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. The words hit harder than any evidence could. The prosecutor, Jane Hollis, felt her heart rate quicken. Emma had just given them a piece of the puzzle that no one could ignore. The broken furniture, the bruises, the shattered glass, all of it lined up with Emma's words. Elmore, now visibly shaken, turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I request a recess." This testimony is going too far. A child cannot make these claims. The judge, however, was resolute. The recess will not be granted. We will continue. As the trial pressed on, the pieces began to fall into place. Emma's whispered words, her drawings, and now her descriptions were all connecting the dots in a way no one had expected. The defense's attempt to discredit her only seemed to strengthen the case against the defendant. Emma had given them the truth, simple and raw, and it was enough to tear apart the defense's argument. Emma, Jane asked gently, "Can you tell us again about the man who hurt your mommy? Can you tell us what he looked like?" Emma looked down at Ranger again, and for a moment it seemed as though she was gathering her thoughts. She leaned in close to the dog, whispering softly as she had done so many times before. She was no longer a scared child hiding from the world. She was the key to the case, and she was ready to unlock it. "I remember," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "He was tall. His face was scary. His eyes were mean. The description was vague, yes, but it was enough." The emotional weight of Emma's testimony was undeniable. The defense had no way to counter it. The more Emma spoke, the clearer the picture became. The physical evidence, the emotional testimony, and now the description all pointed in one direction. The defense was running out of time, and they knew it. Elmore, frustrated, tried one last-ditch effort to undermine Emma's testimony. "You're sure about this, Emma? You're sure he was the man who hurt your mommy?" Emma didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out yet another drawing. This one was different from the others. Darker, sharper, more specific. She handed it to Jane without a word. Jane looked at the picture, and her heart skipped a beat. The figure in the drawing had a square jaw, dark eyes, and angry eyebrows. It was a detailed image, and the resemblance of the man on trial was unmistakable. The defense attorney, who had spent the better part of the trial trying to discredit Emma, was now faced with something he couldn't ignore. The jury leaned in as Jane held up the drawing. The defendant's face went pale as the courtroom fell silent. Emma had done it. She had identified the man who had hurt her mother. "Your Honor," Jane said, her voice steady, "we have a new piece of evidence. Emma has identified the defendant in a drawing. We would like to submit it into evidence." The defense attorney stood, his face flushed with anger. "Objection, Your Honor. This is just a drawing. It's not admissible." But the judge, after a moment of consideration, nodded. "I'll allow it. This will be part of the record." As the trial continued, it became clear to everyone in the room that Emma's testimony had done what no one else could. She had spoken the truth, and she had given them the evidence they needed. With every word, every drawing, every small whisper to Ranger, Emma had dismantled the defense's arguments piece by piece. And as the day drew to a close, the courtroom was left with one undeniable truth. The defense had no more tricks to play. The man who had hurt Emma's mother was about to be exposed, and there was no turning back. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, thick as the humid summer air outside. It wasn't just the words being spoken that had everyone on edge. It was the sense that something big was about to happen. Emma, with her small but steady voice, had shattered the defense's carefully constructed case. Now it was time to follow through, to tie the loose ends together to ensure the truth would win out. The defense, struggling to maintain control, was becoming increasingly desperate. Elmore's confident objections had been met with firm resistance from the judge, and his attempts to discredit Emma were starting to fall flat. The room seemed to collectively lean in, awaiting the next revelation. Jane Hollis, the prosecutor, sat back in her chair, her fingers tapping lightly against the desk. She knew the next step was crucial. Emma's testimony had painted a picture, but there was still one piece missing. Solid evidence to tie the defendant, Gregory Elmore, directly to the crime. She couldn't rely solely on Emma's words, no matter how compelling. She needed something more. "I need to speak with Detective Brooks," Jane said quietly to her assistant, who nodded and quickly left the courtroom to fetch the detective. As the trial recessed for the lunch break, Jane found herself walking down the corridor, her thoughts racing. The case was turning in their favor, but she knew how quickly things could change in a trial like this. She needed the proof, the tangible, irrefutable proof that Elmore was guilty. She didn't have much time. The defense was already regrouping, preparing for their next counterattack. Detective Alan Brooks was already waiting by the back door courthouse, his arms crossed, his expression grim. The man had been investigating this case from the start, and Jane knew that he was her best shot at finding the missing pieces. "I've got something," Brooks said, his voice low, as if the walls might be listening. "It's not much, but it's a start." Brooks handed Jane a folder, and her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside was a set of photos, grainy, low-quality shots from a security camera. They were taken the night of the incident, and as Jane examined them, her heart skipped a beat. In one of the shots, a man was visible near the entrance to the building where Emma and her mother had lived. The man was wearing a red tie. "I've seen him before," Jane said softly, her voice barely audible. "That's Elmore." Brooks nodded. "We've got him on camera near the apartment. We ran the footage through facial recognition, and we were able to match him. The problem is the footage is too blurry to confirm anything concrete, but it's a start." Jane felt a surge of hope rise in her chest. It wasn't definitive, but it was a clue, a significant one. The defense would be hard-pressed to explain away a video showing their client near the scene of the crime. Still, Jane knew she couldn't take chances. She needed more. "Let's get this enhanced. We need it crystal clear," Jane said, her voice determined. "We'll subpoena everything. Bank records, travel receipts, anything that ties him to the scene." Brooks glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "I'll get started right away. But you're right. We need more than just this. If we're going to nail him, we need a solid connection to the victim." That was the breakthrough Jane needed. She couldn't rely on circumstantial evidence alone. They needed a concrete link, something that tied Elmore directly to the attack on Emma's mother. Without it, the defense would surely exploit any doubt they could find. As they parted ways, Jane's mind raced with possibilities. She couldn't afford to get complacent. Elmore's team would be looking for any cracks in the case. She had to be ready for anything. By the time the trial resumed later that afternoon, Jane was armed with a new sense of purpose. The pieces were coming together, but there was still work to be done. She returned to Courtroom with renewed determination, her mind focused on the task ahead. When the trial reconvened, it was clear the defense was ready to fight back. Elmore stood with renewed vigor, his posture stiff and formal. He was confident despite the growing sense of unease in the room. He still believed he could win this case, despite everything that had come to light. Elmore's team is preparing for a last-ditch effort, Jane whispered to her assistant as they took their seats. "They're going to bring in experts to discredit Emma's testimony. We have to be ready for whatever they throw at us." The defense attorney stood and made his objections, trying to discredit Emma's testimony by questioning the reliability of child witnesses. But Jane was prepared. She had already anticipated this. "Your Honor," Jane began, standing and addressing the judge, "I would like to submit new evidence. Footage that was recently recovered from a security camera near the victim's residence, showing the defendant, Gregory Elmore, in the immediate vicinity of the crime scene." The courtroom went still. Jane could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her, waiting for the judge's response. She held her breath as the judge nodded. "I'll allow it," the judge said, and with that simple decision, Jane felt the ground shift under her feet. The battle had just tipped in her favor. The security footage was shown on the large screen at the front of the room. The quality was grainy, as Brooks had warned, but there was no mistaking it. The man in the red tie, clearly identifiable now, was walking into the building where Emma's mother had been attacked. The timeline matched, and it painted a damning picture. "Your Honor," Jane said, her voice steady, "we now have visual confirmation that the defendant was near the scene of the crime. We will be following up with further investigation into his whereabouts that night." Elmore's face had gone pale. The defense team, which had been so sure of their victory, was visibly rattled. They hadn't expected this evidence to come to light. Jane knew she had just dealt a significant blow to their case. But Jane wasn't finished yet. "We also have additional evidence that further links the defendant to the victim," she continued, her voice unwavering. I am submitting these records which show financial transactions between Mr. Elmore and a known associate of the victim. We believe this evidence ties Elmore to the situation. The room fell into stunned silence. Elmore's defense team scrambled to figure out how to counteract this new revelation, but it was clear that the momentum had shifted. Mr. Elmore, the judge said, turning to the defense attorney, it seems that your client's position is becoming increasingly difficult to defend. I would advise you to consider the strength of the evidence before proceeding. For the first time, Elmore looked like a man on the verge of losing everything. His confidence had faltered, and he was struggling to regain his footing. The case, which had seemed like a sure win for the defense, was now hanging by a thread. Jane felt a surge of determination. The pieces were falling into place. The truth was coming out, and with Emma's testimony, Ranger support, and the evidence they had gathered, they were finally on the verge of seeing justice served. The defense had one last chance to make their case, but Jane knew they couldn't win. She had the proof now. Emma had spoken, and her voice, once silent, was now the loudest thing in the room. As the day drew to a close, Jane took a deep breath. They were getting closer, and tomorrow, they would finish this. The courtroom was heavy with anticipation. The air felt thick, like the calm before a storm. This was it, the final act. The evidence was all but laid out. Emma had spoken her truth. Ranger, the brave German shepherd, had stood by her side the entire time, quietly providing the support and comfort that allowed Emma's voice to be heard. And now the defense had no more tricks to play. The pieces had fallen into place, and justice was close. But it wasn't a done deal yet. The final moments of this trial would determine everything. Elmore, the defense attorney, still held on to a thread of hope, though it was thin and frail. The man had been confident, smooth in his approach, thinking he could weather the storm of accusations. But now he was visibly shaken. His usual poise had evaporated, replaced by frustration and desperation. He stood before the judge, attempting to rally his defense with weak arguments, but it was clear his efforts were futile. Jane Hollis, the prosecutor, could feel the weight of the case resting on her shoulders. It had been a long, tough journey to this point. She had poured herself into this trial, piecing together every bit of evidence, listening to every detail of Emma's testimony, and watching as the truth slowly revealed itself layer by layer. The defense had tried to bury it, but they couldn't. The truth had a way of coming to the surface, no matter how deep it was hidden. Your Honor, Jane said, her voice calm and measured, yet filled with an unshakable conviction. We have presented every piece of evidence necessary to show that Gregory Elmore is guilty of the crime he's been accused of. Emma, a 3-year-old child, has given us the most honest and truthful account of what happened that night. And we now have visual, financial, and forensic evidence to back up her testimony. The judge nodded slowly, her face serious. She had seen many cases in her long career, but this one was different. The impact of a child's testimony combined with the loyalty of a dog had made this trial one for the books. She understood what was at stake here, not just for Emma and her mother, but for everyone in that courtroom who had witnessed the quiet bravery of a child who had never been allowed to speak until now. The room was silent as the judge turned to Elmore. "Mr. Elmore," she said, her voice unwavering, "you've had the opportunity to present your defense. Now it is time for the jury to deliberate." Elmore stood still, his face pale. His eyes flicked nervously from the jury to the prosecutor, and then to Emma, who sat quietly beside Ranger. Emma's small hand was still resting on the dog's collar, her fingers lightly grazing the fur. She wasn't looking at anyone. She wasn't worried about the outcome. For the first time in this whole process, she felt safe. The truth had been spoken, and she had done what no one else could do. She had taken back her voice. She had found her strength. As the jury began its deliberation, the courtroom was left in a tense stillness. The clock ticked slowly, each passing second stretching longer than the last. Emma's foster mother, who had been sitting at the back of the room, wiped a tear from her eye. She had watched Emma grow from a silent, fearful child into the brave girl who had stood up and spoken when no one thought she could. "I'm proud of you," she whispered softly to Emma, who glanced up and smiled. A small, quiet smile, but it was real. The room was almost painfully quiet as the jury filed back in. They took their seats, their faces unreadable. Jane held her breath, her heart racing in her chest. She knew the case was solid, but she also knew that a guilty verdict was never a guarantee in any trial. There were always doubts, always variables, but this time she felt something different in the air, a sense of inevitability. The foreman of the jury stood up, holding the verdict in his hands. He cleared his throat, and the silence in the courtroom became even more profound. Everyone's attention was fixed on him. Jane's hands clenched at her sides, her mind racing through the last few weeks, the long hours of preparation, the late nights of strategizing. This was the moment that would determine everything. We, the jury, find the defendant, Gregory Elmore, guilty of the charges of domestic assault and battery. The words hit like a tidal wave. Emma's foster mother let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding, and a quiet murmur rippled through the courtroom. Elmore's face went white. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His once imposing presence had vanished. He was just a man who had been caught, his carefully constructed defenses crumbling in the face of undeniable truth. The judge banged her gavel, signaling the end of the trial. This court is adjourned. The defendant will be sentenced at a later date. As the courtroom emptied, Jane made her way over to Emma and her foster mother. She knelt down beside Emma, offering a warm smile. "You did it," Jane said softly. "You helped make sure the truth was heard." Emma looked up at her, her eyes wide with wonder. "I told them," she whispered. "I told them what happened." "You were amazing," Jane replied, her voice filled with pride. "And Ranger was amazing, too." Ranger, who had been silently standing beside Emma the whole time, gave a small wag of his tail, as if in agreement. He had been more than just a therapy dog. He had been Emma's anchor, her protector, and the one who had helped her speak the truth when no one else could. As Emma left the courtroom, her small hand tightly gripping her foster mother's, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. The weight of the secret she had carried for so long had been lifted. The truth was out there now, and the man who had caused so much pain would face the consequences of his actions. The press, of course, was waiting outside, eager to capture every moment. Jane stepped into the spotlight, ready to address the crowd. "Today, justice was served," she said, her voice strong and clear. "Thanks to the bravery of one small child and the loyalty of a canine companion, we've seen how powerful truth can be. No voice is too small, no story too quiet. And sometimes justice doesn't come in loud words. Sometimes it comes in whispers." As the crowd applauded, Emma, her foster mother, and Ranger walked away from the courthouse together, a new chapter in their lives beginning. Emma had reclaimed her voice, and with it she had found her strength. And Ranger, the dog who stood by her side, had become more than just a witness. He had become a hero. Thank you all for following Emma's journey of courage and healing. What do you think? Could a therapy dog like Ranger really help unlock a child's memory of trauma? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to K9 Miracle Stories today. We share more incredible tales like this, and your support helps us bring them to life.